several months ago, a question had been asked to a very well-known Polish-American political scientist and political theorist, Alan Przeworski, asking him to explain basically the illiberal turn of his native Poland. And his answer was the following. He said, theoretically, this should not have happened. He has been doing it. From this point of view, Poland is an interesting case. You have countries who any type of a basically economic explanation for the populist backlash is not going to work on Poland. For the 27 years, you have an economic growth for every 3 months. Even more, normally people are going to say economic growth, but it's about redistribution. In the case of Poland, in the last 8 years, you have also decline of the basic Gini coefficient. So it's not simply that the country has been growing, but in the last decade it became less unequal than it was. And secondly, if you go on the surveys, you're going to be surprised to see that 77% of the Poles basically are quite satisfied with their personal life. It's a very high percent. Also, paradoxically, Poland and Hungary is also the 2 countries in which the public opinion support for the European Union is highest. Why then? You have a country which basically, according to Przeworski, should very much be perceived as consolidated democracy, which is now very much discussed as a classical case of liberalism. There was a major backlash against the institutions of check and balances. There was a major changes in the constitutional court, high-level political polarization. And what we basically are trying to do is, Stephen Holmes, is to try to reread the last 30 years, very much going back to the 1989 and the idea of the end of history, saying the end of history was very much declaring the age of imitation. What Fukuyama was claiming is that you do not have a universalist challenge to the liberal ideology, and of course he never was saying that they are not going to be political conflicts or that every country is going to become a liberal democracy. But the major story is that what was perceived as the future of the world was very much going to be imitating institutions, lifestyle, political practices coming from the West, and this type of imitation was voluntary. It was not that basically the West was imposing on others to do it, but you imitate in the way you're imitating the best practices in the business world. So this is why Fukuyama himself was insisting that in a certain way competitions between the states are going very much to resemble the competition between companies. Everybody's trying to adopt best practices, and this probably explains the rise of and the global spread of democracy. So the problem is there something about imitation, which is one of the well-known processes of social transformation in general? There is nothing new about imitation that creates a certain type of resentment. And to what extent basically imitation creates resentment, even when imitation can be perceived as successful, like in the case of Poland, and also what is in the book and not in this type of an article that I have been sending, why also the imitated, in this case the United States, felt resentment to the world that they have created. Where is the problem with this? And the major argument, and I'll try to summarize this, I'll go back to the 1989 and trying to compare on 3 levels basically the ideology of the 1989 revolution, which was very much the idea of normality. And many people in the room, and I know that Professor Kьосев and others can be writing about this, but it's quite interesting to read most of the first interpretation of 1989, and you have François Furet, who basically said, listen, this is a revolution, not a single new idea came out of it. And this is interesting because it was the revolution of the intellectuals, but one of the major stories were not about new ideas. The very idea of experiment was perceived as a kind of a dirty word. The second, Habermas, who basically came with the idea of the catch-up revolution, basically said, this is not about new things, this is very much about catching up. It is basically these becoming like the West. I'm just going to stress 2 of the interesting, not so much till now discussed impacts of this idea of normality, very much perceived in political terms, very much perceived as a political culture, what it means to be normal. One of the interesting stories is that imitation always, as I said, was part of the way people have been developing societies, but normally you're imitating something that does not exist. One of the famous literature in theology is imitating Christ. But basically, with any type of utopian projects, you're trying to imitate something that is not there. What was very interesting about 1989 is that future, from the East European point of view, from being based in time, in a certain way was located in space. So if you want to live in the future, crossing the border was enough. And here is one of the first major differences between 1989 and any of the previous revolutions before. Every revolution produces a kind of a major movement of people. Basically, revolutions is about redrawing borders, moral, political, but also geographical. But every time this is the defeated party that is leaving. It was the white French who left after 1789 because basically they had the feeling that France was lost. After 1917, it was the white Russians. Nobody can imagine that Trotsky in 1917 is going to leave St. Petersburg in order to take a fellowship, to go to study abroad. For him, basically, the place of the revolution was where the future was in making. It was totally different in Central and Eastern Europe, exactly because the idea of the normality defined the West as the future of the East. If you want to live in the future now, you basically are going to leave very early on. And as a result of it, paradoxically, one of the paradoxes of the liberal revolution is that one of the first that had left have not been the people that had been against the change, but just the opposite people who have been very much positive and endorsing the change. And going abroad was very much perceived as trying to basically see, to study, or to live in a society that you believe is going to be the future of your own society. I'm saying this because it's quite interesting, basically, and this is not the only explanation, to see the major changes that has happened in demographic terms in Central and Eastern Europe. With the exception of two countries of the region, one of the most common features, no difference between economically successful transition and unsuccessful transition, is the depopulation of the population. And we're talking about a high percentage. It's true for the Baltic countries. There is one country, Czech Republic, which is not fitting to this pattern. But you're going basically to see a major change of the demographic composition when it comes to the generations and so on and so on. So paradoxically, the liberal revolution, the first thing that they produced is a lot of people who are going to define themselves as liberals leaving the country. And for example, in Bulgaria, it was very clear after the 1990 elections being lost by the Union of Democratic Forces. The second important things about this type of imitation perspective is that you're imitating reality, but this reality is changing a lot. Germany in 1990 is not the same as Germany in 2015. And this was particularly interesting, and from this point of view, Poland is a quite interesting case. We're talking about quite important Catholic conservative society for which political normality of the West was very much defined as the West as they perceive it and as they know from the Cold War period, which means the West is an alternative to atheist communist regimes. It believes in God. It's basically traditional in many kind of dimensions of public life. And then suddenly, they're basically facing with the West that is changing, the West that is legalizing gay marriages and others. And for some of these conservative circles, the very idea of the normality is becoming highly problematic. One of the most interesting, in my view, change that we see with the rise of the populist parties in Central and Eastern Europe is that normality, which in the 1990s was a political concept and was very much perceived as the Western societies, now is becoming a cultural concept. And it's very much about the national societies. And the third aspect out of it, and this is also from the point of view of the imitated, just to give one German example, the interesting story is also when you know that others are going to imitate you, what you're exporting. And from this point of view, there is one great example in order to show how much more complex all this process of imitation is. Germany is a classical success story of a transition. And basically, when people are talking about transition from a type of totalitarian regime, and totalitarianism was a key concept with which people have been working in the 1990s, Germany comes to the place. And one of the interesting stories is that if you see the German development, before 1968, you're going to see quite a lot of, first of all, denazification was a very short period of time. It was very much introduced by the foreign occupying powers, and the moments when they were out, it was not much of it. This is why the 68 generation was so very much about dealing with the past. The first things that the Germans did in East Germany was not what they have done in their own transition, but what they do believe that they should have done. So from this point of view, you're not asking others to imitate your own experience. You're basically trying to imitate something that you believe should have been the model of development, but you, one reason or the other, failed to achieve it. And this is quite important, because I do believe one of the biggest problems with the imitation from the point of view of the imitating is that your success all the time is to be verified by somebody who is outside of you. It's always the original who is going to say how successful the replica is. And from this point of view, if you're basically going to see the message coming from the Hungarian government or the Polish government, one of their messages, we do not want to imitate you anymore. Even more, basically, Mr. Orban gave a speech 6 months ago in which he said, for 25 years, the West was the future of Eastern Europe, and we want to be like you. Now we are the future of the West. So the only way to regain sovereignty is basically to claim that you are not imitating anymore. You are the model to be imitated by others. And I'm going to basically end up with two things. How, in my view, this in a way relates also to the problem of the propaganda and the discussion that basically I missed. One of the major and interesting discussions concerning the populist parties in Europe, particularly also Western Europe, was the very strong, for example, declared support almost everywhere. For President Putin, for Russia, it was true for the far right, but it was true to some extent for the far left. And of course, Chantal knows much more. We have to demonstrate on this, but the problem is how, and part of the interpretation was very much in terms of a classical intelligence story. That basically, it was about funding Marie Le Pen, it was about intelligence operation. I'm going to claim that nevertheless, that for sure, there is intelligence activity being involved. There is something much more basic and important in order to understand the position of the populist parties. For the populist parties, in order to be legitimate, the most important is to show how different they are from the establishment and the mainstream. So in order for them to be legitimate, they should attack the center of the consensus of the elite on different issues. To the extent that Russia was part of the consensus of the liberal elites, you're declaring basically your support for Putin and Russia, not particularly because you have special interest or because you have particularly close relations, but because in this symbolic politics, for you it's very important to send the message, I am different. And I do believe this is quite important because then this political logic explains the fact that nevertheless most of these parties have been declaring very much their pro-Russian sympathies, where you see basically with whom the Russian state has been cooperating. In many countries, Austria is an example, it's much more the mainstream parties than the far right, that basically the relations can be taking place. And the second part, which goes with these discussions about propaganda, fake news, and so on, is that I do believe that the problem with the globalization, of course, is challenging the idea of the borders. But one of the borders that the most challenge is the information borders. Before part of the sovereignty of the countries, and this is particularly important for the small countries with the small languages, is that the fact that very few people outside of your country and your ethnic group speak this language. The government has a certain type of a monopoly over the relations with voters and others. This is dramatically changing. And by the way, this is going to change even more dramatically in 10 or 15 years, when all these translation machines are going to start to translate better than people, and then basically everybody is going to have the possibility to communicate to people with dialects and kind of small communities that before had been protected by the fact that they're speaking a very small and unknown language. This created this particular situation in which I do believe under fake news, and we are talking about two different phenomena. Let's give an example. The released email from the Democratic Party emails that have been such an important factor in the American elections was not a fake news. This was the real emails. They were there and they were not doctored. And this is basically the official position of the American government. So it's, what was fake was that you do not know who is speaking. So in a certain way you're getting this information, and from this point of view the WikiLeaks phenomena is a leaker in general, who basically is not getting an identity of its own, but its own purpose is basically to go to leak the information, nevertheless where the information comes from, destroys the major possibility for people to have a kind of a critical relations to the information that they get. And this is who speaks. So from this point of view, to be honest, I don't have any problem with the Russia Today. Russia Today is a propaganda vehicle of the Russian government. You watch it and you know who speaks. You can agree or disagree. But there is no problem of who speaks. The problem comes when basically you do not know who speaks. Because then, and this is going to become in my view even much massive, it's going to be state, but also non-state actors, it could be anybody. You start to live in an information space which is without agent. So probably this is Roland Barthes at the end of the author in its post-radical story. The information basically does not have a source. The information is becoming a kind of a flow that circulates, and everybody can pick up what it wants. And now I'm going to my last point on this as a result of it. And because of the fact that the ideology of normality is not giving a kind of a normative horizon, which was typical for the classical political projects before, you have a major spread of conspiracy theories and the rise of something which is, I'm going to call the paranoid citizen. This paranoid citizen could be very civically active, but now conspiracy theories, much more than ideologies, are becoming the identity makers when it comes to politics. Just to give you one example, on the last elections in Poland, if you want to predict who is going to vote for the governing now Law and Justice Party, the strongest predicator is not education, it's not incomes, it's not even Warsaw versus the countryside. The strongest predicators is, do you believe that what happened in Smolensk, the plane crash that killed the Polish president and 98 other members of the elite, was an assassination or was an accident? Assassination or accident? Those who believed, 92% of those who believed that what happened was an assassination are voting for the governing party. So in a certain way, you have a political identity based on something which for the moment look as a conspiracy theory, because all these investigations that have been done, including by the previous Polish government, is not supported. Why I do believe this is important, and this is really the last point. Ideological position, being a normative position, you can buy the ideology but being in a dissident position, which is very well known for people living in these countries. You can basically be part of the left or the right and being very strongly disagreeing with the leftist parties on the base of the same values in which it is trying to claim its legitimacy, because these values, this normative horizon, is allowing you a critical relationship. With the conspiracy theory, it's not true. You're either buying it or you're not buying it. The moment when you do not believe it is assassination, you're not part of the political community anymore. And I believe from this point of view, it's not simply that you have a major flow of information and all these effects of technologies and so on. I do believe this critical distance, which was so important for any type of a reformist politics, which was so very much important for changing certain political communities, has disappeared. And I'm going to end up with this, that from this point of view, and this was our major claim, in order to understand part of the sources of the populist backlash, don't go to the economy and even basically don't try to find much more ideological consistency in the idea of the liberal democracy that people try to do. It's very much a psychological relations created in the world in which imitation imperative was one of the major organizing principles for the post-Cold War period.
I will focus on two things. First, I will try to question the major term in Ivan's statements. This is the term imitation. And second, I will try to question also the political explanation of populism. which I try to replace with another one, which is culturalist and technological. So, is imitation really the right term to describe what was happening in Eastern Europe after 1989? The term implies psychological reasons. One imitates another because of stupidity, because of lack of sovereignty and authenticity. That means because of inferiority complex. Yet, psychological explanation looks suspicious in the realm of geopolitical and geocultural relations. I prefer another term, which I try to develop elsewhere. It is self-colonization, but I'm not going to explain it right now. On a global scale, since the beginning of the 19th century, the rest of the world was imitating, in inverted commas, the colonial and Eurocentric West, not because of stupidity and lack of authenticity, but because, at the time, everybody in the world believed that the West is the historical bearer of universal modern models. And let me say that models are not imitated. Ideal models are followed, which is something very different. So everybody believed that the West was the historical bearer of universal modern models: progress, enlightenment, reason, freedom, civilization, emancipation, human rights, national sovereignty, cultural, scientific, technological and economic development, welfare for everybody. And this imitation seems to everybody as a kind of historical imperative, synonym of development with and catching up with the rest of the progressive world. So this was really a kind of imperative, I stress on that. It was not because of lack of authenticity. So in the course of the last 2 centuries, however, and their essential conflicts and catastrophes, this universalism proved to be not quite universal. And the model it provides started to be questionable, started to look quite Eurocentric, Western-like, or colonial. They needed a revision, which started actually with the post-colonial movements. Yet this Western-like normative universalism is still alive in the form of utopia of normality one speaks about, and it is the cause of mass immigration toward the West. Not only from Eastern Europe, but from Africa, Asia, and wherever. That means I don't accept the term imitation. I do believe it is misleading, and its connotations are very dangerous. My second point is my attempt to replace, or maybe to add to the political explanation something else. What is the political explanation of populism? It runs like that. Populism happens because of lack of political representation and confrontation of the non-represented masses with the isolated neoliberal elites, which creates a kind of post-political situation and a new divide between masses and elites. This is the paradigm of the political explanation of populism. I do not deny that explanation. It's of course very important, and it explains a lot, but not everything. And I do believe that we have to look another explanation of populism in the realm of digital technology. And that's why this morning I asked Chantal Mouffe my question about the politics of truth, because I do believe that the new digital condition we are living in creates a kind of post-truth situation. And everybody, not only the masses, but the elites as well, are living in this post-truth situation. How it looks like? Actually, it looks like that. A global movement from the living in truth, which was the general condition of the world in the 1989, as Václav Havel defined it, to dwelling in this post-truth situation, because of the inherent cultural split in the new technological development and the digital destruction of the public sphere of life. The best metaphor for that is the so-called interface. Interface is something really double-edged sword, because on one level it's totally democratic. Everybody can use a simple computer interface, because if it's nice, friendly user iconic signs, and you can, or even a child can orient herself or himself in the interface screen and manipulate easily with it. But beneath the interface on the screen, there is a very sophisticated computer program known only to specialists, only to very small micro-technological elites. And this is the split I'm talking about. The split between, let's say, technological access to information to everybody, very democratic and very open, but at the same time, the confining of knowledge in very small technological elites, which are totally non-transparent and which speaks a different digital language, so to say. This split is, in a way, the frame, because for the many people, the digital revolution creates a very new situation. It was not a lack of representation, or not only a lack of representation, it was a lack of orientation. And this lack of orientation caused isolation in small informational communities, into informational balloons, living in popular myths, living in isolated islands of information, which are in a way not object of any kind of verification. Or to put it shortly, living in post-truth situation. In this post-truth situation, the popular myth you are living in is absolutely true, and it's practically non-falsified. Nothing can falsify it. And you can look for a lot of examples, starting from New Age beliefs and religion sects, toward popular magic on the TV, prophecies and whatever, which are very popular right now, and which are combined with a hidden mistrust in science, especially in medical science, especially science about narration. And at the same time, to the same popular myth you can count with also nationalism, because nationalist myths in the contemporary variant are very simplistic. They are lack of any cultural memory, which is characteristic for the age of real nationalism. They are post-myths, so to say. They are simply simplistic, they are popular, and they are impossible to be falsified. They are closed, they are isolated. So enormous populations are living in such popular myths. They are living outside the truth, they are dwelling in the post-truth situation, and this is at least one of the major reasons of populism for me. That means having certain political emancipatory potential on the one hand, on the other, the popular myths are depriving the masses of emancipation, because emancipation, remember Kant, is connected with the famous slogan, dare to think. They don't dare to think, they are dwelling their myths.
It is a very interesting idea to explain the rise of the populisms nowadays with the so-called post-truth situation. For example, this is something that I realized at the moment. For example, if you live in an environment where you don't know who is the messenger of the message, who is the speaker, then the boom of the conspiracy theories could be explained as a wish to find such a speaker without having it present.
May I intervene just for a while?
Yeah.
The very posing of the question, who speaks, is interesting, because not what speaks, but who speaks. That means that the argumentum ad hominem replaces the argumentum ad rem.
Yeah, but the second part of my argument, I continue, is that the rise of the populisms with clear, even antagonistic division between we and them, in all kinds of populism, left and right, could be explained in this case as a reaction of the disorientation in the media, of the absence of clear boundaries. And when you do not have clear boundaries, you wish to fight them.
You create
them. Yes, but this was only a commentary on the panel till the moment. So my original statement is prepared in attempt to combine some themes from Chantal and from Ivan. In fact, I agree with Yanis Stavrakakis that the more formal approaches to populisms are better. In general, I understand populism in a Wittgensteinian sense, as a specific political language game. Hence, the populism can be described through a list of discursive features, a list of short descriptions of the ways the world is articulated by different speakers, individuals, media outlets, civic movements, political parties, and so on. Such a list cannot be exhaustive, and moreover, the definitions in it can have only family resemblances, according to Wittgenstein and me too. To make such a list is almost easy if one carefully borrows from the huge literature, and especially after the seminal works of Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe. Chantal, Yanis, and many of the speakers before me have already emphasized few of the main features of the popular discourse, privileging the people as a single general will, volonté générale, that transcends all group, class, and cultural differences, making from the popular demands chains equivalence, creating also an antagonistic frontier between the people and the elites. These are all Laclau and Chantal. Attacking meritocracy as a principle of legitimating elites, this is and so on. Such a list should be additionally fulfilled and specified, but in any case it describes the grammar of the populist game. If you agree with this formal approach, two warnings are needed. First, no doubt populism is a primitive language game of contesting the status quo. Its discursive features are inherent to every social discontent, to the Bulgarian mass protests from 2013, to Occupy, Indignados, and so on, and a myriad of historical examples we could add here. As a contestation game from below, it has real emancipative power. But the same populist grammar, and here I'm sure that Chantal will disagree, because after Laclau she tries to keep distance between populism and regime, between populism and propaganda. But if we take such a formal approach to take a populism only as a list of features, then we should recognize that these features, this grammar, this populist grammar, could be used and have been used by the totalitarian propagandas, both of the communists and of the Nazi. It is also inherent to the discourses of the different authoritarian and or illiberal regimes today. So, the populist grammar can be used, taken formally, for the sake of governmentality, but not for emancipation. Said figuratively, in these cases it works not according to some logic of equivalence, but according to the logic of difference. I'm paraphrasing Chantal and Laclau. It divides society, oppressing and even directly repressing parts of it. Second, depending on the concrete use, the meanings of the people shift. Yanis and also Buyan has already distinguished one left inclusive, enlarging solidarity, and one right exclusive, ethnic, racial meaning of the people. But the problem, especially nowadays, is that two power meanings quite often fuse in the practical uses. And they more often fuse, unfortunately, in the right direction. So, we should put two different questions to the populism from the last decade. The first one concerns their causes. What motivates the social discontents erupting through populist grammar, both in the leftist movements and in the rising support for the right parties and regimes? Is there something in common? And the second question concerns their hegemonic governmental effects. What happens when, in our case, the national populisms come to power, when they become regimes of governmentality? Iván Krъстев is maybe the best analyst explaining the reasons of the recent populisms on the level of the political psychology. He argued just now that the East European liberal rebellion in Hungary and Poland foremost has its roots in the popular feelings of humiliation, feelings that have been repressed in the decades of mimesis and liberal self-normalization and self-westernization. But now these feelings burst out. Yes, such resentments are really observable in Bulgaria too. Quotation, they, the West, treat us as second-hand people. This is one of the most popular, most often heard by us statement in our focus groups and in the national surveys of the our team. Another fear, that of depopulation of Eastern Europe, stemming from the aging but also from the intensive emigration to the West, again is brilliantly analyzed by Ivan. Now, after the migrant crisis, this fear is paradoxically, psychologically substituted for another one, for the fear of immigrants. This substituted fear turns into anti-immigrant hysteria without immigrants. This is a quotation for their common paper with Holmes. But political psychology has its own perils. One can read explaining the liberal populist turn, political psychological terms, as a warning to some Western arrogance toward the East, but another one can also read it as subtle legitimation of some authoritarian practices in the East, where Kremlin is a role model. In fact, I prefer not to resurrect the East-West dilemma, because there are significant similarities between the popular fears and discontents, both in the East and in the West. The global feelings of uncertainty in front of the neoliberal globalization, the fears and resentments of the precarious life, not only in regions with declined industry, but in fact everywhere, these phenomena are well described by many authors and by Ivan himself. But we should make a step beyond political psychology, I think. We are to explain what actually causes these popular feelings. My generalized answer is, in our time, it is a matter of fact that economic and technological globalization has by far outstripped political globalization. That the globalization of the political forms of market regulation and social redistribution is lagging behind the neoliberal market globalization seems to me a directly tangible, main, and entirely legitimate reason for the rise of the discontents that have turned into a populist wave in the last decade. An irony of fate is that now there is no global political answer to this global problem. And the ongoing processes of geopolitical rebalancing is a part of this. Such an answer, by default, should be left one. But the left is in a crisis, as Chantal explained us very well, the crisis of its third way. We witness how the right national populisms often absorb the people's left discontents. This is totally true for the Eastern Europe, but also for Trump and for all nationalist populist parties rising in Europe. So to say, the left meaning of the people is going to be eaten by the right meaning of the national populisms. Indeed, up to the moment, there is no other known, ready at hand, political frame, different from the nation-state, arranged to guarantee direct representation, fair economic regulation, and social redistribution. And EU, as a semi-global project, still does not meet these requirements. But on the other hand, it is hardly to believe that the nation-states, and especially the small countries, can really meet the challenges of the economic globalization, framing them in a sufficient way in isolationist terms. Moreover, our study shows that the national populisms again and easily become a propaganda weapon. And this is true not only for the Kremlin sovereign's propaganda, but also for that of other speakers, Trump, Orban, Kaczynski, Sidorov, Ninova, Erdogan, and etc. Their populist propaganda narratives, generally speaking, are an ideal tool for a state capture. Blaming Brussels for its dictate over the national politics and economics is a perfect tool to resist international monitoring and control. Appealing to the people's sovereignty, inciting to the migrants, and claiming for immediate strong leaderships, all these are perfect tools to go beyond the internal separation of powers and beyond all checks and balances inscribed into the national liberal democratic institutions. And finally, blaming the civic protests, the NGOs, the independent media and magistracy, to be Sorosoids and grand spongers, in fact foreign agents. This is again an ideal tool to block every civic resistance from inside. There is a nationalist populist propaganda is an ideal tool for a state capture because it is aimed at annihilation of all the critical barriers against the monopolization of power. Of course, the state capture is a good instrument for some local elites, let's call them local oligarchs, to resist in the competition with the global corporative and political elites, if you want to call them global oligarchs. But the state capture is by no means an instrument serving the ordinary people marginalized by the globalization. According to our study, limited to the Bulgarian media but with obvious resemblances with other contexts, and not only in Eastern Europe, we witness the rise of a new populist propaganda discursive front, which is anti-liberal and anti-globalist. But in this front, the legitimate popular discontents from the new liberal globalization are often being appropriated by local oligarchic actors, packaging those discontents in a nationalist governmental form. In this front, after its nationalistic propaganda absorption, nothing left has left, I think. The main peril in its rise is that it systematically subverts liberalism. However, by liberalism I understand neither the new liberal economic fundamentalism nor the overextended cultural liberalism of recognizing every identity and difference. I mean simply our modern political tradition that tries to guarantee social solidarity, institutionalizing at many levels critical barriers against the monopolization of any political and economic power. Losing the modern barriers against monopoly of power can turn into loss of normality in every predictable sense. To put it more clear, if we take this tripartite model that is developed by Nancy Fraser, Axel Honneth, and many others, you know that the long and difficult but full with struggles story of the liberal democracy can be described as three periods of developing equality. Starting with founding equality on a political level, upgrading it with social rights, and trying to prevent the cultural discrimination in the last decades. I'm nearly terrified at the moment, after reading so much media, blaming all that I, in short, has shown. I'm really terrified that the new nationalist populists become, the new nationalist populists are on a path to catch the social discontents, to package them in formally populist, but in fact culturally conservative terms, and through this to undermine the basic political, classical liberal foundations of our democracies.